when people talk about the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, it's interesting because they tend to overlook the role of the Aztecs and the other peoples of Amerindians of Central America in the downfall of the Aztec Empire. One could argue that the downfall of the Aztec Empire was kind of already in progress or was going to happen at some point or another. Because when we look at the actual army strength for this period, you'll find that more than 90% of the Spanish army was not actually made up of Spaniards, it was made up of allied tribes. The Aztecs are probably the most brutal people in human history. Probably even more so in some sense than the Mongols. Because as we'll get into, in a lot of cases, their motivation for conquest was not power or expanding their empire. In fact, they didn't really annex territory in the way we would understand it, like in the way the Assyrians, who were also extremely brutal, or the Ottomans would. Because when the Ottomans or the Assyrians would conquer territory, they'd be extremely brutal, but they would eventually set up some sort of civilian government and integrate it into the state. The Aztecs very rarely did that, and instead, well, we'll get into that in a minute. But if we look at the strength totals for this war, like I said, we have only about 2,500 Spanish conquistadors combined with up to 200,000 allies. So once again, there's 100 times roughly as many allies as there are actual Spanish. Now, the Spanish had a lot of advantages: metal armor, guns, cannons, ships, horses, etc. But I think you can make an argument that if it wasn't for this huge coalition that formed around the Spanish, they might not have been able to defeat the Aztecs. I mean, disease probably would have eventually taken them down. But to a large extent, the fall of the Aztec Empire can be understood in the context of how they ruled and how everybody hated them. And this was not a new thing. From the first moments, basically, that the Aztecs, or the Mexicas, we'll refer to them, emerged on the peninsula, they were universally despised. And the second the Spanish showed up and there was kind of a rallying cry, a lot of their vassals and tributaries immediately defected because they didn't want to be under the rule of these guys anymore. So we're going to go through, the following are passages from a book called Fire and Blood, A History of Mexico, which I read a while ago. And I've been meaning to do a reading from some of the passages from this book because they're hilarious, and the very nonchalant way the author writes truly horrific stuff is funny. So let's go into the origins of the Aztecs, how they built their empire, and yeah, so let's just switch over. So here's a quote that the author starts the chapter out with. When the Mexica erected a temple to Huitzilopochtli, I'm going to butcher it, the Koala came and asked them, "What will you put in such a great temple?" The Mexica told them, "Fresh hearts and warm blood." Then the Koala were angry and threw foul things into the temple. Specifically, they threw in feces and that kind of thing. Huitzilopochtli appeared in the 12th century when he was a man. He led his people from place to place. When he became a god, he spoke to his people. And just for context, the Aztecs are interesting in that they were largely, I refer to them as a theocracy. The speaker, or the emperor, for lack of a better term, was both high priest and secular ruler. Now, all ancient societies had a religious character to them. And all ancient societies were, to a certain extent, legitimized by the favor of the gods. But in particular, as societies like ancient Assyria, where the king was also the high priest of the god Ashur, and the conquest was seen as bringing glory to Ashur, and it was something that was legitimately believed. It wasn't just a justification for the plebs. In a very real sense, the upper class did believe these things. It was sincere, even if it was also for pragmatic reasons. Let's see here. Mexican accounts say their god constantly ordered them to move on, and for many years the tribe did not stay in one place. This was probably due less to orders from their god than to the fact that no other tribe found them comfortable neighbors. This is going to be a recurrent theme. So from the very beginning, nobody liked them. There are a number of legends or accounts detailing events of these years. Interestingly, they all indicate that the Mexica were particularly detested and abhorred because their incorrigible women stealing and love of human sacrifice. So in other words, they were kind of alpha manlets. In the 13th century, the Mexico begged, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that, for permission to inhabit a hill of Chapu Chapultepec. Chapultepec? It doesn't matter. From which they drove out another Indian tribe squatter band. The Mexica lived around the area until the end of the century, making many enemies and no friends. I love the nonchalant language. On one occasion, the rulers across the lake sent an expedition against them. The Mexica were routed, and their war chief and his daughters were captured and sacrificed. The Mexica say that the survivors of the raid hid weeping in the reeds and cattail rushes along the lake. So, almost immediately, the first kind of place they tried to permanently settle, they managed to anger everybody, and there was like a coalition to overthrow them. At a later time, Cox, Lord of Kulhanaka, I'm just going to try and abridge this as much as possible. People get irritated when I can't pronounce things. Permitted the tribe to hold some useless snake-infested territory, but the Mexica apparently thrived on eating rattlesnakes, grew stronger, and erected a temple to Hichizapotle. That's like something out of Dragon Ball Z. Like, you can just picture them like a training montage in the swamp eating rattlesnakes. Now, someone actually offered an explanation for this. Snakes are one of the most protein rich animals you can eat. I think they're almost entirely 100% protein, and there was very little protein within the Central American diet, at least meat protein. So maybe the large access to protein let them grow stronger and grow taller than the neighboring tribes. But it sounds like some like Dragon Ball Z thing where they're like training in the wilderness and they're eating rattlesnakes to like absorb their power. The same accounts state that the Kuahua, however, were disgusted at particularly bloody Mexica sacrificial practices and on one occasion threw feces into their temple. But the Mexica were fierce and thus useful. If disgusting neighbors, they were frequently used with to fight against neighboring countries. The Cox enlisted the Mexican tribesmen as mercenaries, promising them freedom if they would capture 8,000 of their enemies. The tribes did so and brought large bags of ears to the throne, cut from the captives. The pictographs show Cox registering horror at these bloody trophies, but he kept his promise. Now the Mexica asked for a favorite daughter of Cox, that they might pay her a great honor. Cox, the ruler of the land that the Mexica were a vassal of, was invited to attend the ceremony. When Cox arrived in the Mexica temple, he found a Mexica priest prancing about in his daughter's skin. The girl had been sacrificed and flayed. Cox bellowed for his warriors, and once again the bewildered Mexica had to flee into the marshes and reeds. I love bewildered. I love how the Mexica are like, look, we sacrificed her to Hichicapotle. We sacrificed her. She's in heaven now with him. Why are you so upset? Like, this is just kind of a normal thing. And I love how the people around him, even if they were also like from ostensibly the same cultural background, hated them and thought they were disgusting. These let's see here. When their former overlords ceased hunting them, the bedraggled tribesmen suddenly took refuge on two low-lying swampy islands out in the lake, called the Place of Mud. These barren offshore islands were sort of a no man's land outside the hegemonies of the major powers. Here the Mexica were able to eke out a miserable existence, mostly from lake products like fish and duck's eggs, for several generations. They held these mud flats by sufferance of powerful neighbors who were probably restrained more by the balance of power than respect for the inhabitants. All accounts agree that the Mexica were despised and humiliated because of their ferocious practices. The clans on the island were ostracized and driven in upon themselves. Some historians believe this experience led to the later characteristics of the race, the extraordinary unity of the Mexican nation, its belligerence, and its merciless aggression against all outsiders. The Mexica shared these traits to an almost unbelievable degree. Yeah, the Mexico were an extremely oppressive society, even to their normal people, where most crimes were punishable by brutal death. The thing is, because of how disciplined their society was, crime was almost unknown. It was very rare that any of the punishments were enforced because they had been so unified. According to this legend, the Mexica wandered from place to place, seeking a sacred spot where, according to the prophecies, they would see an eagle perched upon a cactus growing out of a stone. They discovered this phenomena with a serpent in the eagle's beak at Tenochtitlan. That is on the flag of Mexico today. The eagle holding the serpent. The modern Mexico is very belligerent very bipolar in how they view the Indios. On one hand, they're like, we're the Aztecs, we're badasses, we're the heirs to the Aztecs, but they hate modern Indians. They despise them. They victimize them, they treat them like crap, they kill them, they drive them off their land. It's really funny. Let's see here. The original new light was thrown on this legend when in modern times a stone carving was unearthed on the site of the present-day National Palace of Mexico. This original carving, which was the symbolic pictographs undoubtedly were meant to represent, is in full scale quite different from the eagle and the cactus on the stone. In this sculpture, the pears of the cactus are not pears at all, but stylized human hearts, and the cactus itself is a mass of hearts emerging from the open chest of a sacrificial victim. The eagle representative of Hichichipotle does not have a serpent in its beak, but rather a curlicue, which is the Nahuatl glyph symbolizing war. This whole symbology is much more characteristic of the Mexica ethos than the romanticized myth invented out of the misinterpretation of the pictograph. It wasn't a misinterpretation when they were trying to kind of build a Mexican identity post-independence. They drew on a bunch of Aztec myths and they kind of sanitized them. So instead of like a mountain of human hearts, it was a cactus, which is kind of interesting. Let's see here. Logic has not, however, prevented the mystical version of this founding of Tenochtitlan. Okay. So the Mexico lived in a primitive society of kinship bands and clans. As they gradually grew agrarian, a warrior peasant community, the clan structure had survived. Each tribe had its own totem. Let's see here. Mexico had no sense of individuality or personal autonomy. Intensely parochial, the clan's great strength was that it stood as one body in work and war. This was harmless compared to the now rendering of the cult of Hichichipotle, the tribal deity. Now, Hichichipotle was offered the most extravagant praise. He was shown to be equal or even superior of the other powerful Amerindian gods. He had always required human blood, but now the high priest interpreted the will of Hichichipotle in a stunning revelation. Okay, I'm going to try and read this in epic terms. The sun god was also the god of war, and he had chosen the Mexica for a great mission, to bring together all nations into the service of the sun. The Mexica were to subdue the world and offer Hichichipotle continual blood, which he required so that he might continue to rise in the east and vanquish the night. Unless Hichichipotle was refreshed and strengthened, he could not replenish the earth. He had called the Mexica to this special service, so they might gain great honor and glory. As agents of the god, the tribe would become demigods, rulers in his name of all the earth. The warriors who fed Hichichipotle, either through the hearts of enemies or by their own blood in battle, were assured of eternity in the east heaven of the sun, the most exalted of Mesoamerican paradises. So, as with kind of a lot of Greek things, it's kind of interesting just kind of how pagan gods work. So Hichichipotle was both like the hummingbird deity, but he was also the sun, and they could kind of exist in two places at once. So the Aztecs believed if they didn't offer him blood, then the sun wouldn't continue to rise. That their blood is what allowed him to rise and set. Which you got to wonder what happened before the Aztecs existed. I don't know. I guess that's just what they thought. Here indeed was a divine mission, promising lordship in this life and heaven thereafter. And the Mexica as a whole people seized upon it eagerly. The outstanding characteristic of the Mexica people in their great century was the mystical belligerency that some modern Mexican intellectuals deny, and most historians find almost incredible. The Mexica did not invent holy war. He only gave the old Mesoamerican mythology a new and violent thrust. Blood magic was part of the culture, and religious warfare came down from ancient times. More is known about the empire of Tenochtitlan than the great Mexican hegemonies that preceded it. But since it is well known that the Mexica were adaptive rather than creative, the Mexica Empire perhaps tells a great deal about the earlier realms. These cities were populated, let's see here. Perhaps the ruling circle of the Mexico were unafraid that a hungry Hichichipotle would refuse to replenish the earth, and perhaps the nobility and warriors may have only dreamed of glory, wealth, and power. But it would be a mistake to consider their warfare pragmatic. Behind it all was haunting dread. The Mexican tribesmen believed in their war god. They believed in the immortality of the soul, and they believed the universe was ruled by their magic. Thousands fell, the sun fed. Many Mexico won their eternal reward, and each year the power and wealth of Tenochtitlan swelled. The snake-hide drum, which sounded only to signal human sacrifice or herald war, boomed its dismal message out over the lake. Spaniards who heard it wrote that the monstrous drum could be heard 2 leagues away, and that its sound made his hair stand up on the nape of the neck. The Mexica continuously found pretexts for war, a refusal to pay tribute, an insult to an ambassador. And the Mexica enjoyed cultivating insults or interfering with traveling merchants. The Mexica were also scrupulous about declaring war and sending advance notice. So we're going to get into this in a minute. So one of the things that they always... the Mexica didn't, beyond the original 3-city alliance, they didn't really annex territory. They would subjugate the territory around them, which collectively had a much higher population than the empire proper. And they would kind of almost deliberately let these cities periodically rebel over time. The idea being, since their goal was not so much political conquest as feeding blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, they wanted these cities to rebel so they could go in and harvest them. They're called the Flower Wars, and it's very much they would conquer these cities, sack them, steal all their money, take away their males for humans, take away their people for human sacrifices. Then they'd come back a generation later once the population had regenerated itself. So a note about Amerindian warfare. The first prisoners taken in an action. The first prisoners taken in an action had to be dragged to the rear and sacrificed at once, which sometimes delayed the final assault. The battle ended when one side was overwhelmed. So they would literally stop the battle, more or less, to bring the sacrifices behind. And we'll get into this in a second, but the Aztecs kind of had practical reason to believe this worked, because they had basically beaten everybody in Central America, and they kept beating everyone in Central America. Because their society was totalitarian in nature and absolutely united by terror and loyalty, and because of how ferocious they were in their belief in their divine mission, it gave them the success as if the divine vision worked, which further fueled their fanaticism. Let's see here. The sacrificial ardor had effects beyond the destruction of human life. After 1450, the empirical nature of Mexican imperialism began to change. The ancient Mexican imperialism had been pragmatic in its struggle for predominance and power, but now Mexican armies tended to see the purpose of warfare more and more as a search for sacrificial victims. The warrior who took 4 live captives were honored over one who merely killed 4 enemies in combat. Just think about that for a minute. Like the goal wasn't victory anymore. However, every Mesoamerican was steeped in the knowledge and fear that his gods, gods could and would visit communal destruction on the whole race if they failed to provide the proper sacrifices. The common people at Tenochtitlan took these disasters as evidence that the gods were displeased. So if there was a rain, an earthquake, I believe Central America is fairly I forget what the term is. Geoactive. There's like a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes and that kind of thing. In the face of mass panic, the rulers of Tenochtitlan panicked, and they undertook enormous efforts to appease the gods. So this was an ancient tradition. Human sacrifice, as with a lot of early societies, was present. It often wasn't particularly common. The Carthaginians, I think, practiced it fairly significantly, as did the Phoenicians. But most societies practiced it in some form. Like Abraham, while reluctant to sacrifice his son, the Bible doesn't really indicate that he thought this as a particularly unusual thing to do. With regards to how much the Greeks or Romans did, I don't think it was very common. They certainly used it as propaganda against the Carthaginians, but this was something that did take place to a certain degree within most ancient societies. There is not much evidence that in early Amerindian culture this had gotten much out of hand. Symbolic destruction had been kept at symbolic levels. It probably was not much more extensive than comparative practices among the ancient Syrians and Mesopotamians, or the Germans and Celtic Druids. A few warriors were killed ceremonially to please the sun, and a few virgins sacrificed to assure the sprouting of corn. But now that the Mexica reacted violently according to their culture, the slant in dynamism had given the cult of Hichichipotle the dynamism given to the cult of their god resulted in a vast orgy of destruction. Montezuma the First mounted expeditions to the south and east to find thousands of new victims. According to the Mexica's own records, the fury did not cease until at least 10,000 men were slaughtered at Tenochtitlan. This sacrificial orgy was unparalleled in all of human history, and it seems to have spread over much of Mexico. There was no essential differences between the Mexica and most of their tributaries and enemies. The Mexica, however, had greater opportunity to seize such victories. The final tragedy was that in Amerindian eyes, this magic worked. Following the shower of hot blood, the frost ceased and the sun again warmed the earth. The corn flourished. The lords of Tenochtitlan took credit for averting disaster. And the ruler urged the people to build a newer and more magnificent temple to Hichichipotle. And from this time forward, ceremonial mass murder was not only institutionalized but uncontrollable. The rulers could not have halted the practice had they wanted to. The perversion produced one unique manifestation, the development of the so-called Flower War. The Mexica met both their enemies and their subject cities, so, like I said, the tributaries, in prearranged ceremonial battles, whose sole purpose on each side was the seizure of prisoners for sacrifice. The Mexica fought these especially with Tlaxcala. I'm not going to try to pronounce the others. A flower war ended by agreement when one or both sides had taken all the victims it needed or desired. All cities killed their prisoners basically in the same way for the same reasons. Being taken in a flower war and dying on the altar was an honor. The Amerindian culture never escaped its primordial belief that the manner of a man's death was more important in eternity than the manner of his life. The mass orgies of destruction that swept the highlands could not have been carried out on so long had there not been a passive acceptance among the victims. Warriors tried to die well. Besides the carterectomies, flayings, and burnings before the gods, there was another form of sacrifice called gladiatorial combat. A prisoner who defeated 5 warriors could win his life, and the Mexica had records of such cases. There were also records of prisoners who won freedom, but in throes of exultation continued to fight until they died. Let's see. These perversions of the practical purpose of war fatally flawed Amerindian military tactics in the next century and did much to ensure the civilization's downfall. Yeah, they weren't fighting real wars anymore. And Montezuma, once again, I know that's not his name, but I can't pronounce his name, had begun to handle friend and foe alike with contempt. And this manner pointed up the complete political failure of Mexico's drive for empire. They were steadily conquering their world, but they were utterly failing to create a greater society or a Mexica universal state. The tribe allowed no people except for the Texoca an honorable place in their empire. Thus, they turned what might have been a promising confederacy or a Pax Mexicana into a world of lords and slaves, a world seething with perennial revolt. Okay, so to put this in context, imagine that the kings of France only held their traditional land of Orleans and Paris, but they had succeeded in subduing the rest of France, and they refused to integrate the rest of France into their realm. It was entirely composed of vassal states. So there was no, like, they actively resisted developing a French identity. There was no concept of French nobility or French citizenship. They all just existed at the whim of the monarch who had virtually no power. Now, this isn't quite the same thing, but my point is, imagine if other societies functioned this way. Imagine if, like, China was only, like, the area or the province of Beijing or Peking or whatever you want to call it, and the rest of China were just tributaries. I mean, it's innately a very unstable, flawed system. Thus, they turned what had been a promising confederacy or a Pax Mexicana state into a world of lords and slaves, a world seething with perennial revolt. Because oftentimes people can be integrated. There is a desire to be part of something bigger, and after the initial kind of slaughtering conquest, if a city's integrated, they're offered citizenship, a degree of self-rule, they might even become loyal to the empire. I mean, empires require at least the acquiescence of their subjects. I mean, in a lot of cases, like I said, once France was unified, there wasn't really that much talk of secession from the composite parts. It's oftentimes once these states are unified, the sub provinces will become fairly loyal to the, if not the exact central government, to the idea of a greater nation state. They either subjected every people who with they came in contact with or made them pay tribute, and failing this made perpetual war. They did not incorporate the fallen centers into their political structure. They made a sullen empire of rulers and ruled. Like Montezuma, the next emperor failed to reduce Tlaxcala, although he was able to conquer all the territory that surrounded their mountain fortresses. Some historians attribute this failure to deliberate policy. The Mexica preferred to maintain Tlaxcala as a strong neighbor to supply them with captives, and on which they could hone their arms. But this theory does not fit the Mexica character. I don't know, I think it does. He certainly would have subjugated the Tlaxcala could he have done so at a reasonable cost. From 1870s on, perpetual warfare ensured between the two peoples. The conflict may have been an exercise for the Mexica, but it was an intolerable burden for the Tlaxcala, and it sowed a lasting hatred which would not have disappeared between the two regions in the 20th century. Yeah, the Tlaxcala were the first and most loyal allies of the Spanish. Now, what's interesting is we always hear about how the Europeans betrayed the native peoples that they made allies with. So, if memory serves, the agreement the Spanish made with the Tlaxcala, who immediately jumped ship and joined them, was they'd never have to pay taxes. The nobility of the Tlaxcala lands would be confirmed. That the size of the Tlaxcala would be doubled. All these other kind of benefits and privileges, and the Spanish kept it. Tlaxcala never had to pay taxes. I believe that they even gave parts of northern Mexico to Tlaxcalan settlers. And they were loyal to Spain for the remainder of the Mexican Empire. I think what people fail to realize is when Latin American independence came about, it was because of the criollos. The actual Indios liked the Spanish government because the Spanish government largely treated them fairly. They tried to limit slavery of Amerindians. They tried to limit the brutal way they were treated. And when Simon Bolivar was conquering Latin America, he was mainly having to fight Indios armies that would be raised to try to prevent the independence of the colonies. Because they were pretty happy with the situation as was. Like I said, it was the criollos who wanted basically absolute power. So yeah, that's the story of the Aztecs. That's why everybody hated them so much. And that's why they collapsed as soon as the Spanish showed up. Because literally everybody hated them. They made no attempt to build a greater Mexico. And their civilization was kind of collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the story. If you guys want me to do more historical stories like this, let me know. This one I've been meaning to do for a while. I like to call this LARPing too hard. So I'll talk to you guys later.